Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm very excited about today's webinar and today's speaker, which is the topic will be encouraging pro-environmental behaviors, what works, what doesn't, and why. So to get started, I just wanted to let you know that this webinar is being broadcast from the desks of ACEEE. My name is Reuven Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. And I co-chair the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, which is bringing to us today's webinar. I'm joined with Maxine Jacumbo on the back end here, the associate with our communications program. And so she'll be listening for your questions and helping to handle that as we get through the end of the webinar. Before we get started, I'm very excited to tell you, you can tell by the exclamation mark and the bold letters here, the BECC virtual conference agenda is out now. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go to beccconference.org and read up. There's a lot of interesting talks, great speakers. And I wanted to let you know that the discounted rate ends on November 16th. The early bird rate is finished now, but make sure you register before November 16th before prices go up again. And of course, the conference is December 7th to 10th, totally virtual this year. So very convenient, more affordable. We look forward to seeing you there. And of course, we have to acknowledge our sponsors for today's webinar and the conference in general. Without these generous sponsors, this webinar and the conference simply could not happen. So I do urge you to check out these companies and the wonderful work that they are doing at the nexus of behavior, energy, and climate change. And also, before we get started, I need to tell you about a very exciting webinar that's coming up next month, and this will be the last one before the conference itself. Please check out our webinar with Dr. Shazeen Attari, Fusing Facts and Feelings to Motivate Action on Climate Change. And you can register for that right now for free at the beccconference.org website under webinars. And finally, before we get started, a few logistics. All of you are currently in listen-only mode. We will have time for questions after the presentation, so please send them to us using the chat box at any time. We have Maxine monitoring the chat box, and she'll be asking our speaker the questions once we get to the end. And also, don't worry, today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll get a link to that webinar after the whole thing's done. And so you don't need to scribble down all your ideas. You can just listen, sit back, and enjoy. I also want to note that today's webinar will be audio/slides only, as we had a few interesting technical issues with our current speaker. So you won't see her, but you'll hear her, and that is probably more important. So getting to today's speaker, I am very excited to introduce to you Dr. Wokje Abrahamse. Wokje is an environmental psychologist and a senior lecturer in environmental studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And that's, you may be wondering why we did our webinar today at 4 p.m. and that's because Wokje has very generously agreed to do this webinar for us at 9 in the morning, which means logging in at 8:30. Wokje's research focuses, broadly speaking, on the relationships between people and the natural and urban environment. Her work includes climate change communication, environmental risk perception, urban sustainability, and environmental behavior change. She spells behavior with a U, like many of us who are outside the United States. She also recently published a very handy guide on behavior change interventions, which you can see here, behavior change interventions using environmental psychology principles. And I know from personal experience that she's a wonderful person and an excellent speaker. So it's gonna be great pride to introduce you, Dr. Wokje Abrahamse. And I will now transfer Dr. Abrahamse the power, and you will become the presenter. So please go ahead and share your screen once you have the opportunity.
Can you hear me and see the slides?
We can hear you and we can see those slides.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Reuven, for this very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be giving this webinar for me this morning, for some of you this afternoon or even this evening. So welcome to this webinar. So the topic of my talk will be around encouraging pro-environmental behavior, what works, what doesn't, and why. And so I do a lot of research on this topic, and as Ruben also briefly mentioned, I've written a book about it, and it's a little bit ironic in a way that I am studying this topic because I'm not actually very good at changing my own behavior. Earlier in the year, New Zealand went into, as many other places, went into lockdown, and so for a very, very long time, I've tried to become a morning person. I'm not a morning person at all, and so sitting here at 9 a.m. is a little bit of a struggle for me. And so I decided that lockdown would be a great opportunity to try and make this change in my life and get up early and become a morning person. This was partly informed by this, the stress around having to navigate all these other people around. And so I figured if I go early and go for my walks, then I, can adhere to the physical distancing and so on. Needless to say, my attempts were not very successful. I'm still not a morning person, even though we have now come out of lockdown. So it's an interesting sort of issue because lockdown was in a way a very kind of big event for a lot of people, and a lot of people sort of tried to rethink some of the decisions they made and try to make some changes, some more successful than others. And these are just some photos of my usual walking route during lockdown. As you can see, not many people around, but once lockdown kind of gradually eased, I'm now going for my walks in the evening or in the late afternoon. So I asked my students the same question. We've just come out of our teaching trimester, our spring semester, or the equivalent of spring semester here in New Zealand. So I asked my students, have you made any significant behavior changes during lockdown? And I asked them to write a blog about it. And their experience largely mirrored my experience that while we all had good intentions in wanting to make changes to our behavior, several kind of barriers and issues sort of happened whereby we were off to a good start, but then gradually we reverted back to our normal kind of behavior. I guess this is an introduction to sort of introduce you to the key questions I'm going to ask and not necessarily answer, but kind of hopefully bring out in a discussion at the end of this talk as well. Why is behavior change so difficult? And I'll give you some different perspectives on this. And knowing what we know about behavior change and why it might be difficult to change, how can we use behavior change interventions to encourage changes in people's behaviors? So I'll focus predominantly on environmental behaviors, a little bit of a focus on energy because that's where most of my research is on, but I have a few other examples in here as well. So really what I'm trying to do is understand why is it difficult to change our environmental behavior, and how can we use insights from psychology to help develop our understanding of behavior change and also develop better / more effective behavior change interventions. So those are the two questions I'm going to address in this webinar today. So there are different perspectives on why behavior change is so difficult. So several or many researchers argue that motivations are really important. Now, I won't go into these in much detail because I know that Bob Gifford gave a webinar as well earlier this year looking at kind of what he calls the dragons of inaction. So why are people not necessarily engaging in pro-environmental action? But for example, so this line of research sort of argues that we need to look at people's beliefs, people's attitudes, people's perceptions of social norms. What do other people do in order to better understand behavior? And the idea here is that if we understand what motivates people, we can then use that information to design effective behavior change interventions. So if people have specific beliefs about climate change, for example, or they have specific attitudes towards a behavior, we can then design interventions that specifically address, for example, misperceptions about climate change or people's kind of opinions or beliefs about certain behaviors that we could address via behavior change interventions. Right, so an example here from New Zealand where I live. Right, so this is sort of appealing. This is a Keep New Zealand Beautiful campaign, and I got this from their Facebook page. Right, do the right thing. So this is appealing to people's social norm and kind of this expectation that New Zealand is known for its clean and greenness, and so doing the right thing means that we should not litter and pollute the environment. So this campaign or this poster, if you will, uses social norms or an appeal to social norms to encourage people to reduce littering. As I said, I won't go into too much detail here, but I guess the key thing to understand is that understanding people's motivations can help us design better behavior change interventions. So I'll talk a little bit more about social norms later on in the talk, because it's been used a lot as part of interventions, and many of you may be familiar with this. So social norms refer to what we think is expected of us. So for example, the do not litter, kind of keeping New Zealand clean and green. So what are the expectations around our behavior, but also what we see other people do. And so when maybe I've lived in I lived in Canada for several years, and that's also how I know Reuven. We shared a hallway back in the day, and so maybe I've lived in Canada for too long, but I was just stunned at the amount of jaywalking that happens in Wellington. And so these pedestrians look at the bus, which is a good thing, but often people just cross at the pedestrian crossing, at the traffic lights, and they often don't even look at the traffic. They just look at other people and they follow them and cross the road. So, and I'm one of those people who sort of diligently waits by the traffic light, and then I often get really bizarre stares. And sometimes people even tell me, "You can cross, it's okay, there's no traffic." And so there's sort of a different expectation about what is expected and behavior. So the idea behind social norms, and I'll give some examples later on in this talk as well, is that social norms guide our behavior when these norms are made salient. So when we see other people jaywalking, we might be more likely to do the same. If we see other people littering, we might also be likely to do the same. So this is one example that looks at kind of understanding people's motivations, and this is, our behavior is often guided by what other people do, whether we are aware of it or not. We can use that sort of insight about social norms to encourage behavior change and design interventions to kind of emphasize those norms. So I often get my students to work on projects. As I said, I've just come out of a teaching trimester, so I'm probably still also quite kind of in sort of that sort of mode. Really trying to profile some of the work of my students. So they try to replicate a study that Robert Cialdini and his colleagues did many years ago to look at whether people are more likely to litter in littered environments. So littered environments, the idea here is that they effectively are a social cue to our behavior. So when we are in a littered environment, the idea is that people are much more likely to litter. And so this is a photo that's taken outside of the coffee shop that I often frequent, that I go to a lot, often sort of on my way into work. And so this is a problematic area because lots of people sort of smoke there. It's a designated smoking area, and cigarette butts are littered all around the place. So my students several years ago worked on this problem using theories about social norms. So I'll show you the results, and this is just an illustration of sort of how we can sort of use social norms to look at behavior. So they looked at different stages of littering. So they tidied it up. So they took away all the litter and all the cigarette butts. They had a semi-littered environment where they placed several items of litter around, and then they created a very littered environment where they just basically made it very messy and lots of litter. Right, so here I'll just quickly show you the results. So basically, this is the baseline is business as usual. When they tidied it up, the proportion of people who littered was reduced slightly, but here, as you can see, the more litter there was, the more likely it was that other people were littering as well. So this corroborates the findings by Robert Cialdini, and it was sort of an interesting experience for the students as well. Not in the least because when they were creating the very littered environment one morning, they were photographed putting the litter out in front of Big Books, the coffee shop, and this made it onto the university Facebook group, and it created a huge discussion about littering and lots of debates online. And so the students actually ended up having to discontinue the study because it had become known. Somebody had guessed that this was part of a study, and so they had to abandon the study earlier on. But sort of an interesting, I mean, it sparked a whole lot of discussion about littering and what's acceptable behavior and not. So this is an example of how social norms guide our behavior, and so the cues in the environment sort of tell us what do other people do and what is acceptable. So that's the first line of research is looking at motivations. The second, I mean, and there's many more different perspectives on this, but another perspective looks at habits. And so I'm going to, again, divert a little bit and talk about a really neat study that was done by Wendy Wood and her colleagues. Wendy Wood is a well-known researcher on habit. And so they did a study where they invited participants into their campus cinema, and they gave them popcorn. And so I've kind of labeled this the popcorn study. And this really shows very neatly how our behavior is determined by habits. So they randomly assigned people to different groups, and they either gave people freshly made popcorn, or they gave them popcorn that was 7 days old. And so this was apparently sitting in a Ziploc bag for 7 days in their lab, and then they gave it to their participants. They also asked people about their popcorn eating habits. So how often would they normally eat popcorn when they were in the cinema? And so this meant that they had 4 groups of people effectively. So they had people with weak popcorn habits, they had people with strong popcorn habits, they had people who had been given freshly made popcorn, and they had people who had unfortunately had received the 7-day-old stale popcorn. So what this allowed them to do was to look at, well, how much popcorn do people actually eat? Does this depend on whether or not it's stale? Does it also depend on whether or not people have strong or weak popcorn eating habits? And they also asked them about their preferences and the extent to which they liked the popcorn. So I'll show you the results. So again, there are 4 groups. So the people who received the fresh popcorn, people who received the stale popcorn, people with weak habits, and people with strong habits. So I'll show you what happened with the fresh popcorn first. So perhaps not unexpectedly, even people with strong habits are a little bit more likely to eat more popcorn, but generally speaking, a lot of people eat a lot of popcorn. But this is an interesting finding when it comes to and so this is 7-day-old stale popcorn, and still about 70% of people with strong popcorn habits would still eat the popcorn, right? So this was 7-day-old stale popcorn. And so this is so this sort of suggests that the cinema in a way acts as a cue for people's when people have strong popcorn habits, being in a cinema and being given popcorn, whether it's stale or not, prompts them to eat a lot of popcorn. So they also asked whether people liked the popcorn, and it turned out that not many people, in fact, liked the stale popcorn. So this is sort of an indication that even though people didn't like the stale popcorn, they were still eating it, right? So this is sort of an argument that, when habits are very strong, motivations or preferences play a less important role. I mean, they've done a lot of, Wendy Wood and colleagues have done a lot of interesting research on this. So if you're interested, there's a very interesting podcast called Hidden Brain, and their research is featured in an episode called Creatures of Habit, if you're interested in learning more about this. Right, so their research sort of really suggests that habits are important, and so habits are about how often we do a behavior. So I often drink coffee. I might even think that I'm a coffee addict, and this probably has something to do with the fact that I am not a morning person. But it's not just about whether or not you do a behavior often, it's also about automaticity. So there's an element of, I don't even think about it, I just, I make my breakfast and I always make coffee. I don't go, shall I make a cup of tea today, or shall I do this, or there's always, I don't even think about it, I just make the coffee, right? So there's an element of automatic behavior in that. There's also often an element of that there's a cue in the environment, and for example, this could be the cinema in the previous example, or me getting out of bed and making my breakfast cues me to do the behavior. And in the cinema example, it was eating popcorn, and in my example, it's making coffee. So habits have these elements that, and when you think about this, this also gives some insights into how we could perhaps change behavior, in the sense that when habits are really strong, sometimes things like giving people more information is not necessarily going to work, because it's cues in the environment, or it's this kind of automaticity that drives people's behavior. And so we need to think about other types of interventions to guide people's behavior, and I'll come back to that in a moment as well. So I've talked about different views on why behavior change is difficult. So there's research looking at people's motivations and understanding people's motivations to get a better sense of why it's difficult to change people's environmental behavior. There's also research on habits that I talked about, kind of looking at, the kind of repeated, kind of unconscious, automatic behaviors. But individual behavior change is really important when we think about reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Often individuals can make a significant contribution in terms of reducing emissions, and there's sort of a lot of research on this as well. So there's an issue there. So behavior change is tricky, but it's important if we want to at least contribute to reducing our climate impact. So I would argue, and many of my colleagues would probably also argue, that we can use insights from psychology and environmental psychology to inform the design of behavior change interventions. There are often assumptions about what works in terms of behavior change, and I'll talk about two of these in a moment, and then I'll kind of wrap up and talk about what we could do differently and how we could improve our interventions. So there's quite a few examples of information campaigns, which is probably one of the most widely used approach to change people's behavior, right? So the idea here is that by giving people more knowledge, by giving people a sense, like a higher awareness of the issue, that this will mean that they will that they will change their behavior and do something. So these are two images of an ad that ran in the UK several years ago. It's called Bedtime Story, and in this advertisement campaign, this was aimed to raise awareness of climate change among the UK population, and it features a father who tells his daughter a bedtime story about climate change, and as you can see from the drowning animals, it's not a very happy story. And so, as I said, the aim was to raise awareness, but what happened was that a lot of people phoned in to whatever advertising regulator the UK has, I forget what the name is now, because they complained about the climate change ad. They said it was misleading, excessively scary, and also sort of, kind of using kind of guilt and fear appeals. And so it ended up that they withdrew the ad from television. And so this is an example of a campaign that was well-intentioned, but that in a way backfired because people were sort of not on board with the message, if you will, and received so many complaints that they had to withdraw it. So as I said, education and information campaigns are commonly used, and they have the idea of this, they're based on this idea of knowledge deficit, right? So we need to just provide, people just are not aware of the problem. We need to provide better knowledge or more knowledge, and this will then lead to behavior change. And obviously, I'm not saying that that we shouldn't be focusing on education and information, because they are really important, but in and of themselves, education and information do not necessarily change behavior. We need other approaches to kind of support information as well, because obviously we need people to know about certain things, like how can they save the most energy, or how is climate change, or why is climate change happening, what impacts will it have. So it plays a really important role, but on its own, it will probably not be very effective. And there's lots of research findings to suggest that that is the case, that on its own, it does not necessarily change behavior. The second common assumption is that people are largely motivated by financial concerns. And this is, of course, true to a large degree. Many people are sort of motivated by money. A lot of economic policies are also based on that. But there's research from psychology to suggest that that the uptake of, for example, rebate schemes or home insulation schemes or other kind of financial incentive schemes to help reduce energy consumption or reduce emissions, that the uptake of those programs is not always as high as you would expect based on economic models or economic predictions. So there's something else going on. Not everybody is, it might be the way that, sort of the high upfront cost people might not sort of want to invest a lot of money, or sort of the payback scheme is not clearly communicated to them. Other ways in which behavior can be encouraged or discouraged in this case would be through using carbon taxes or charges, like the congestion charge, for example, in places like London and Stockholm. So those are generally very effective in terms of reducing emissions and congestion, but there the issue is of public acceptability. So people might not necessarily want to, they don't necessarily accept the charge and are not necessarily in favor of it, which limits kind of the political feasibility of implementing those. There are exceptions, obviously, but the British Columbia carbon tax, for example, is, I think, touted as an example of where it did potentially work quite well. So just to give you another example of how research from the social sciences can kind of give us some insight into what might be going on. And so this is a study that perhaps many of you are familiar with, that looked at giving people information or feedback about their energy consumption, and they either framed this in terms of how much money they could save. So here the idea was that people might be largely motivated by monetary concerns, and so so the idea was that this would help save energy, or they received a public health message. There was also a control group, but I won't go into that for the purpose of this talk. Right. So the money message was really about how much money they had saved, and so this was different. I put insert dollar amount. This was different for different households depending on how much electricity they had saved. The public health message was about kind of how many pollutants or the amount of pollutants they had avoided into the atmosphere. And so this was an example of how these messages were framed differently. So one message was mostly about money, and the other was mostly about public health. This is not the entire message. I just kind of used parts of it just also for readability purposes. But some people only received the money message, and other people only received the public health message. Right, and so this, the results of this study made headlines, newspaper headlines, because they are sort of contrary to what economists and perhaps other people would predict. Right, so as you would expect, the public health message, people or households achieved energy saving, so 8% reduction in energy consumption, whereas the money message resulted in an increase in energy consumption by 4%. Right, and so this is contrary to what one would expect, is that if you give people information about how much money they have saved, that this actually increased their energy consumption, which is sort of an odd, well, an unexpected finding, if you will. And so this is an example of how research can sort of sometimes highlight things that are not necessarily what you would expect. So there's several explanations for this finding. It could be that the savings were not high enough. So this sort of gives us some indication that if we do look at providing people information about the monetary savings, that if they're not high enough, it might not actually be a sufficient enough motivator to change people's behavior. The other thing, and this is where a lot of economists do a lot of research on, what is known as the rebound effect. So what might have happened is that people who were told they had saved all this money, they actually then invested this money into something else that also used energy. So maybe they left their lights on for longer. And there is research, for example, by a German group of researchers where they found that when households with energy saving light bulbs didn't actually use more electricity that compared with households who didn't have them. And I think something has to do with behavior, right? They either left them on for longer or other sorts of issues as well. So that's known as the rebound effect, which economists sort of write quite a lot about. The other thing, and Wesley Schultz has pointed this out in some of his writing, is that when people are told about the financial kind of reasons for saving energy or to kind of deal with poor environmental behavior, is that it frames environmental behavior as a financial transaction. And this might not necessarily match people's motivations, right? So there's research on kind of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So if you do something for some sort of external reward, like financial savings, this is known as an extrinsic motivation. But if people are concerned about the environment and want to save energy, they're not all that fussed about saving money. If you then give them information about saving money, it doesn't align with their motivations, and so it might backfire. I mean, there's probably lots of other different reasons why this finding may have happened, but as I said, it made a lot of headlines because it's such an unexpected finding. But it gives us some indication that it's really important to think carefully about when we design interventions to change people's behavior, that we think about what motivates people, and what, you know, if people are not necessarily motivated by money, how can we design interventions in a slightly different way. So I want to just wrap up the talk by also, because I can sort of say, well, this doesn't work and that doesn't work, but what does work, right? What are some of the approaches that might be more effective? So I'll wrap up the presentation with a few examples from some of the work that I've been involved in, but also others have been involved in as well. And then I'm happy to, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I talked about information and how information on its own is not necessarily effective on its own, but there's other ways in which we can still give out information but make it more relevant to households. So general information about environmental problems may not be effective, but the provision of tailored information is perhaps a more promising avenue. And this is some of the work that I've done several years ago now, where we provided households with tailor-made information. So so we kind of looked at what appliances do people own, what behaviors do they do, and based on that, we gave them specific energy saving options and energy saving tips. So rather than giving them a general kind of a lot of information about a lot of different things, we gave them very specific information. We combined this with goal setting and feedback. Because the research also suggests that when you use a combination of interventions, they tend to be more effective. Again, kind of coming back to the point I made earlier, that information on its own will not necessarily be effective, but that it's a good idea to kind of bring in other interventions that support it. So the idea was that if we gave people information and we gave them a goal to strive for, but also gave them feedback about how they were doing, that this would motivate people's behavior change. And this is what we found. We did find that some behaviors were people were more likely to change some behaviors rather than others. And I'm happy to talk about some of those in the Q&A. So yes, we found an effect, but it was different for different behaviors. But we also found an increase in knowledge about energy conservation. So it sort of showed that when we think about changing behavior, if we can change people's knowledge, then that might translate into behavior changes. Another approach is the use of feedback. I've mentioned it a little bit. So this is my energy bill from several months ago now. Bearing in mind that July is winter in New Zealand, so I use more electricity in July than in summer. So it does this. It provides me with feedback. So it gives me a star for for saving. And I of course deliberately picked this one to show you that I saved electricity. There have been months where I have used more electricity, right? And it gives me a breakdown per hour. And so the idea behind feedback is that it enhances people's, their sense that they can make a change, and that their attempts to change behavior are effective and are reaping benefits. Right, so Beth Carlin and her colleagues have done a meta-analysis looking at the effective feedback provision on energy conservation, and found that it was generally effective, generally an effective approach, and that's also what my research earlier had also found. There are differences, in terms of how often you give feedback or the kind of feedback you give. Again, I can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But generally speaking, giving people feedback can be an effective approach to change behavior. I talked a little bit about social norms and social influence, so that has also been used increasingly actually as part of intervention. So if we know that social norms guide our behavior, then we can kind of embed that in information provision. So this is an example of water conservation, but again, it's sort of looking at how you are doing compared to, in this case, the average household and the top 20%. So this sort of gives people feedback, not about their own performance, but also relative to other people. So this is known as social comparison, right? And so this idea that if I compare myself to other people, this will be a drive to change my behavior and do even better than other people, for example. So a couple of years ago, Linda Stech and myself, we did a meta-analysis looking at the effectiveness of social influence approaches. As I said, they're a growing field. So we looked at things like the use of social norms, the use of social comparison, as illustrated in this water saver leaflet, things like public commitments. So whether you kind of commit publicly to some sort of goal to save energy or drive less or so on. And so we found that generally those approaches are an effective approach. So they tend to encourage behavior change when we compared it to a control group. Right, so there's quite a lot of research and evidence to sort of that suggests that these sorts of approaches are effective. Those interventions focus mostly on people's motivations. So I talk, about social norms and knowledge and attitudes. But you might be wondering, well, what about habits? What if our behavior is very strongly habitual and they're very routinized and automatic? How do we change those sorts of behaviors? And you will probably be very familiar with this idea of nudging, right? So this idea of nudging is that you change the environment in which people make decisions, you change the choice architecture to facilitate behaviors, and often people might not necessarily even be aware of this. So I found this very recent study just out earlier this year, or even a few months ago, where they looked at the effect of opt-out schemes. So this is changing the default effectively. So in Germany, generally you would pay, as a consumer, you would generally pay more for green electricity. So this is electricity from renewable sources, as opposed to gray electricity, which is generated from fossil fuels. And what they did was they made it an opt-out scheme. So in some regions of Germany, and so people they were automatically signed on to the green scheme, and they had to actively opt out. And so what they found, they used a large sample of German residents, and they found that the uptake was higher when this was an opt-out scheme. So people were more likely to stick with the status quo, if you will, stick with the green default. So again, the reference is there if you want to read up on that study. Just came out earlier a few months ago. Right, so nudging can be particularly useful to change behavior when behavior is quite automatic and you don't really think about it. Another example is, for example, food consumption. I've most recently done, I'm doing a little bit more research on vegetarianism and meat consumption. Right, and so there's quite a bit of research to suggest that if you nudge people, because food choices are very habitual, and so it can be an option to. So this was a study from the UK where they effectively increased the availability of vegetarian options and found that increased the uptake of vegetarian sales without necessarily affecting overall sales. So so that's kind of an interesting finding as well. So it's sort of nudging could be useful when we think about habitual behavior, and changing the default could help with those sorts of behaviors that are quite automatic and routinized, or routine behaviors. So I hope I've now given you a good kind of snapshot. I could have talked for a long time. My students know this, I always go over time. I guess the key argument I wanted to make in this webinar is that we need insights from psychology. I mean, not just psychology, but the social sciences more broadly, to think about how we can change behavior and how can we improve the effectiveness of behavior change interventions. As I said, kind of commonly held assumptions about what motivates people and what are effective approaches to change behavior, and they may not always work as well as we thought or as well as we intended. And so insights from the social sciences, including psychology, can help improve the effectiveness of some of those approaches. And it's also really important to think about that, evidence-based is a term that's perhaps used quite a lot in policy making, knowing what works and what doesn't work. Often, as I mentioned, there are assumptions about what works, but often approaches are not necessarily evaluated in terms of their effectiveness. So it's really important to kind of draw on literature and meta-analyses and sort of reviews to sort of look at what works and what doesn't work so well, and how can we really improve behavior change interventions. So I feel I talked quite fast. That was partly because I was worried I would go over time, but and I have the references here if people want to look it up later. But thank you very much for joining this webinar, and it's been my pleasure to. It's a bit odd to give a lecture or to give a talk without seeing the audience, so yeah, I'm happy to take questions, and thanks again to Ruben and Maxine for organizing this and inviting me to give this webinar. So I'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Wokje. And yes, I'm sorry that you couldn't see Wokje today, but I think that we can agree that was a really interesting and insightful talk. We have lots of really interesting questions. I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to all of them, but I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So Maxine's got them queued up for you, and we're just going to go through a few of them. And have no fear, if your question is not answered, we will send Wokje the list of all the people that asked them, and hopefully she'll have a time in the next little while to get back to you. So Maxine, what's on the docket here?
Sure, I have a couple questions here. So first question, is there research on the effectiveness of learning in group settings, like for example, workshops or seminars?
There is some, but not a huge amount. I think those are probably the kinds of interventions that are not necessarily evaluated systematically. I know of some, I think there's some early work around kind of the, excuse me, the effective workshops where they kind of looked at, I think it was an energy conservation workshop, and they looked at the effectiveness of that. I'm sure there is some research, but it's not very, there's not a lot of it, that I'm aware of.
Okay, another question here. How are climate change behaviors impacted by implicit attitudes? Are implicit biases / attitudes a worthwhile or feasible target of climate change interventions?
Sorry, could you repeat the last half? Our attitudes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Right, the last half. Are implicit biases or attitudes a worthwhile or feasible target of climate change interventions?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. So the issue with climate change communication is often that people have very sort of entrenched views about this, and giving people more information might not necessarily work, partly because of something called confirmation bias, whereby people tend to seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs. So even if you were to target people's attitudes or kind of concern, then if they don't seek out that information, if they don't really necessarily buy into climate change or only parts of it, you know, they sort of think climate change is happening, but it's not caused by humans, for example, it might not necessarily work because they wouldn't necessarily seek out the information. But there has been some research by Paul Bain, who is in Australia, who did a research on kind of how to communicate climate change, and he did look at different levels of agreement with climate change. So he asked people about their belief in climate change, and then he divided them into kind of climate, I guess he called them climate skeptics and climate believers, and he found that kind of framing a message around climate change was not very effective for climate believers, but if he framed the message in terms of economic benefits or the green economy or even social, like social community, that was a more effective approach in terms of increasing people's intentions and awareness. So I guess it partly comes back to framing and kind of making sure that, and I think other researchers have also argued that it's important to sort of know what kind of people's opinion, and then sort of frame your communication accordingly. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Wokje, do you have any comments on the part of this question that has to do with implicit attitudes? Is there any research on targeting people's implicit attitudes or biases, and is that effective at all?
Oh, I have to say I'm not really familiar with research on implicit attitudes. I'm sure there is, but I'm not familiar with it, so I can't really answer the question. I'm sorry. There is research, but I don't know the outcomes of the studies.
It's a different area that I think that many of us studying this are not super familiar with. In general, my understanding of implicit bias is that, or implicit attitudes, is that they're less, they have less of an impact on people's behaviors than you might think. Mm. But again, that's an area of research that neither of us are experts in, I think.
No.
So this is a comment question. So it says, I've read research that suggests that the effect of social comparison just averages out because those who use less start using more resources, even though it motivates those who are using more than average to reduce their resource use. Regression to the mean, if you will. Could you speak to this? How do we avoid regression to the mean when giving social comparison messaging?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think research by Wesley Schultz has and others have shown this as well, is that when you give social comparison feedback that people who are sort of below, so what happens is that, you know, sort of people are often compared to the average or the average neighbor or average kind of resident in your neighborhood. And so when people are sitting above the average, they tend to reduce their energy consumption or change their behavior, or change their behavior in the right direction, if you will, whereas people who are below the average tend to increase their consumption. I think, and so perhaps because they think, well, I'm doing better, or I have some room to move, right? I can use a bit more because other people are using more. And I think what the research by Wesley Schultz has indicated is that if you combine that sort of social comparison feedback with a social norm that sort of talks about the approval. So this is called an injunctive norm, where you not only tell people about how their energy conservation or their behavior, but you also kind of give an endorsement of it and say that you know there's sort of a level of approval that can counteract that effect. That sort of regression to the mean that you were referring to. But it is, I mean, it comes back to the issue of that you kind of, that interventions can sometimes have different effect for different groups of people. And so it's always important to, you know, when you design those sorts of approaches that it may not work in the same way for everybody. And also not everybody is sort of, you know, there's also differences in the extent to which people are influenced by social norms, for example. So, but I think on average, I think studies, large scale studies have shown that it tends to be effective. But yeah, there is this issue of the subgroups of people for whom the effect is slightly different.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question? This is something that I've struggled with. If you were running an intervention like this, would you maybe just avoid giving people feedback if they're doing better than average?
Ah, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of it that way. That could be, but they would, yeah, yeah, you could consider doing that, not giving them the average, but give them a different, give them like just their own individual feedback and give them some sort of endorsement that that's a good thing or something like that. Yeah, hadn't thought of that.
So there's a couple of questions that have kind of been connected to feedback, and I'll use this one to anchor them. So a common question. So there's a limit to how much you can reduce your energy consumption. So after how long does the same feedback, e.g. you're doing well, but using the same week to week, get stale and ineffectual?
Yeah, so I think there's different, I think Beth Carlin, I don't know if she's in the audience, but she will probably be much better placed to answer this question. But I think there's sort of short-term effects tend to be stronger than longer-term effects. So you're right that sometimes, and this goes for a lot of interventions actually, not just feedback, is that the effect sort of tends to taper off, partly because people might just get used to it and they, or they might not sort of be motivated by it after a while, or they go, oh, but I had a house guest, so that means that's the reason why I increased my energy, and so it's nothing to do with, you know, it's not my behavior. But so yeah, so it's I guess the issue I think is that a lot of intervention studies often tend to only have short-term effect measurements and not necessarily longer-term effects, and so it's sometimes really hard to kind of draw clear-cut conclusions about this because we just don't necessarily know. And I appreciate that setting up an intervention study is a lot of work, and so it requires monitoring people over a longer period of time. And so I think that's an issue that intervention research is sort of perhaps dealing with, is sort of how do we actually affect sustained changes? How do we create durable changes with some of these interventions? And the only way to know this is to monitor behavior for a longer period of time than we're perhaps currently doing in our studies or some of our studies. But yeah, that's a great question. But again, I don't know if it's, you know, if I can really answer it in a with a yes no type of question or answer. But yeah, we just don't know enough, I guess.
Okay, and here's a kind of a specific case question. So this person says, we are hoping to encourage homeowners to switch from gray to green energy for home heating, which requires purchasing an electric heat system or heat pump. What would you suggest to help motivate people to switch as financial incentives are not working at the scale needed?
So is it to get uptake of green electricity? Like, is it a program that's running and you need, and there's,
I believe
sorry?
that they're asking about how to encourage people to install electric heat pumps to replace their natural gas heaters when there is no financial case for electric.
Yeah.
And you might not spend more money, but you won't save money.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So again, I'm not sure if I know the answer to this, but so there's some research to suggest that communicating the financial payoff can be useful. So the high upfront cost, kind of communicating to people kind of the payback time. With some other kind of, there's also some research that a lot of technological, because it's basically a technological, it's a different appliance that you're encouraging people to adopt, right? So these often or sometimes can happen through social influence. So there's some research from geography actually to suggest that some energy efficient equipment it's socially clustered. So when people have an appliance, it means that they talk to their neighbors or they know somebody who has the appliance, and so that helps with the dissemination of this innovation. So some sort of social media kind of campaign or something to promote this and have people perhaps from the community. I don't know if it's directed specifically to a community or to a neighborhood, is sort of use the power of social influence. What else can I come up with? Yeah, it's tricky because it's sort of it's not necessarily a behavior you're getting people to change, but it's adopting a different appliance and a more efficient appliance. And so there's sort of different, but there's research on kind of how innovation sort of can be adopted through social networks. I'm happy to send some papers as well. If you email me directly, I'm happy to share those with you.
Great. Another question here. Do you think an appeal to emotion is more effective than the one to reason?
That's a great question. Perhaps I mean, it depends. So it comes back to knowing what motivates people. So some people probably are sort of their behavior is perhaps driven by kind of rational decision making, right? This is also what sort of some of the theories in psychology sort of assume, is that people make rational choices between costs and benefits and then choose the behavior that is most likely of their sort of beneficial. But of course, when you think about issues like climate change, they're hugely emotive, and when you think about the impacts of climate change and thinking about future generations, and so perhaps some of the communication can also appeal to some of those more emotional kind of responses that people might have. Yeah, I mean, I haven't done research on this myself, and I don't know enough about it to really kind of say, but yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think perhaps, I mean, there's also lots of research now emerging from the arts and from music, like kind of how do you communicate climate change, for example, in a way that it's not just about the facts and kind of rational choices, but also about what it means for people in people's daily lives, and sort of using other and perhaps more emotive kind of ways of engaging people. So I think there is, as I said, I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of it, but I think it would be an interesting approach, that not everybody will be swayed by facts, but perhaps more by kind of the emotions that people have about issues like climate change.
Okay, before I jump to the next question, sorry, Wokje, a couple of people were asking about references. Did you have a slide for that?
Yes, at the end. Yeah. Yeah, I have a slide at the end with
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, if we could keep that up. I think some people wanted to see that.
Oh, yeah.
So another question here, does culture influence the design of behavior change interventions? If so, does that mean the interventions differ by the context and targeted group of people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, I haven't done a lot of research on this myself, but I would, I mean, culture plays a very important role in kind of how people even relate to the environment and how they might change their behavior or what is socially acceptable or not. And so yes, it does have an impact, but I have to admit that a lot of the research that I've reviewed comes mostly from Western cultures. So you know, Europe, Northern European countries, North America. And so it's sometimes quite difficult to sort of generalize and say, well, it works in this country or something works in this culture, and will that also work in other places? Yeah, so it's it's a very interesting kind of question to think about. I would suspect that it definitely has an impact, but there's just not a lot of comparative research to suggest kind of the impact of culture on behavior change and the design of interventions. Yeah, I hope that more or less answers the question. I can look into it a little bit more and perhaps send you some more information, but yeah, a lot of the research that I've reviewed and that I'm familiar with comes from Western countries.
Okay, another question here. Have there been studies that compare negative and positive messaging for impact and sustained behavior change?
Yes and no. So there's research on what is known as so message framing, so gain versus loss framing, so positive versus negative framing. So especially in the area of climate change communication. So if we, so the gain frame would be something along the lines, if we do something, this can help reduce emissions, and the loss or the negative message would be, if we don't do something, we'll have more flooding and so on and so forth. So the research I'm familiar with has looked mostly at those sort of message framing studies and the impact on attitudes and intentions, and you do see some effect. So mostly, I think for climate change communication, I think positive messaging tends to be more effective than negatively framed messages. But I'm not aware of any research on behavior. So often these studies are done like on online surveys, for example, and they don't necessarily include a behavioral measure. So that's definitely something that future research would need to look at. But there is definitely research on this, and I'm again happy to share some of this with you. If you email me directly, I'm happy to send some of that work to you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then I'll wrap it up. We have so many fascinating questions and a really engaged group here. So clearly you're doing something right. Maxine, go ahead.
Okay, just one more question here. Could you elaborate on research that, rather than focusing on savings from actions already taken, in this case, swapping out an inefficient light bulb, instead focuses on potential savings if an action would be taken?
So the study that I talked about that I did several years ago did that. So we told people, so we gave people information about how much how much energy they could potentially save. So we gave them a list of various energy saving options, and it had the savings attached to it. So this was around, but then we also gave them, so that was before the intervention, and then we gave them the information, and then we looked at the effects. But because we combined it with feedback and goal setting, it's very difficult to say whether it's that component that was associated with the change. So I don't, and there's other studies as well on kind of people's perceptions of kind of energy consumption and kind of misperceptions, kind of assumptions about what uses a lot of energy and what doesn't. But I'm not sure if there's a lot of research on kind of actual changes in behavior as a result of that, other than the study I mentioned, which again, I'm happy to send to you.
Thank you, Wokje. As I mentioned, so many questions. We had 279 people attending today. We had 44 questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we will send Wokje the list of everyone who asked questions and the questions they asked. She can get back to you. And you can continue the conversation. I wanted to remind you all that our next webinar is going to be November 12th. This is the last one before the virtual conference itself, which I'm very excited about. And Dr. Shazina Tari will talk about fusing facts and feelings. We had a few questions today about emotions and the role of emotions. You can learn more about that in our next webinar. And of course, please register for the BECC conference as soon as possible. Especially students. Students have BECC fellowship opportunities, which really reduces the price, and there's a limited number available. but they are still available. So if you are a student or you know any students, go to the BECC website right now and check it out. Thank you very much for coming again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.